talk to us about architecting microservices, right? Do I have those right? Before we get into those, just wanted to go through the normal process of, announcements and all that stuff. So this is Ithaca Web People, first Tuesday of every month. Our venue and food is brought to you by Funkhaus, which is the space that we're in. And our beverages are brought to you by Invision. And I believe that as a first kickoff announcement, I read that Singlebrook was doing a little bit of, you guys are looking for someone. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? One of you?
Yeah. We're just starting to look for an apprentice, do some web and or mobile development. We're doing a lot of JavaScript, we're doing a lot of Rails, and we're looking for someone to teach who's got enough experience to know that they're interested in learning. But yeah, check us out, singlebrook.com. Come talk to me later if you're interested or somebody might be interested.
Does anyone else hiring or have any announcements to say to the group or anything? Yes.
Hi everybody, my name is Jeremy. I'm a senior IC student and I'm looking for a little bit of help in terms of either Drupal or WordPress, just some pointers and directions. We're trying to redesign an entire big website. So I need some little pointers and things like that would be really great. If you talk to me afterwards, it'd be awesome.
Right on. Yes?
Hi, my name is Nick. I work for Challenge Workforce Solutions. We're an agency that supports folks with disabilities and finding employment. I have a couple people looking for front-end web development type positions, and I don't know much about anything in the tech industry, so I'm here to learn a little bit and try to make some connections.
Awesome. Nice.
Invision is always hiring. If you want to work remotely and doing awesome work, you can go and React.
Cool. Sounds good. All right. Did we get all those? Did we cover all of it? Cool. Trying to think of anything else that's worth announcing. We have at Funkhaus, we do, which we just did last week, but we do a bi-monthly AI meetup. If anyone is interested in that field, that's something that's worth getting into. Our next one won't be until May, but we're always looking for speakers and community involvement there. Cool. So that's it. Now I bring you Luke Jones.
Hello. Are there any designers here at all? Yes. So I came here last month. It was awesome, but I realized there weren't really any designers around. So I wanted to do a talk about something that you folks think about, but from a design perspective, and that's speed. So I am a senior product designer at a company called Dockyard. We specialize in web applications, so primarily web apps. We're doing a lot of work with Netflix at the moment. This is about speed from a design perspective, and it's really about what can designers do to enhance the experience for the user. Now, before I get into it, I just want to say that I'm not very prescriptive in the kind of talks that I do. I don't like to give advice. I'd rather give examples and people ask questions, that kind of thing. So feel free to just shout out any thoughts or anything to me. I'm not about the prescriptive life. Do your thing. So this is the quote that made me start thinking about speed. So to the typical user, speed doesn't only mean performance. Users' perception of your site's speed is heavily influenced by their overall experience, including how efficiently they can get what they want out of your site and how responsive your site feels. So that was a quote from Roma Shah, who's a user experience researcher at Google. Now, what this means is that speed isn't just a performance factor, such as like caching images or reducing the number of lines in code, that kind of things. It's more about how people interpret speed. So you could have the fastest website in the world and it could still feel slow to people. And what we need to start doing is manipulating how people perceive speed. on the web. The reason this is possible is because your brains are not clocks. So every one of you has a really shit brain when it comes to, thank you. Every one of you suck. No, every one of you has a bad brain when it comes to perceiving time. And that's because there are two types of time. There's clock time, which is how long it takes the second hand to move around a clock. And there's brain time, which is how long it takes you to perceive that time. It's biased, which is why when you're watching a really bad film, it feels as though it takes ages. But when you're like frolicking through a field or something, it feels like amazing. It's like no time at all. So brain time, thank you. Brain time is the thing that we can manipulate and should manipulate. Now, I'm using this word a lot, which has some bad connotations around it. But think about manipulation as a chiropractor would. Hope you're okay. Disgusting the word manipulate. So think about the word manipulate as a chiropractor would manipulate your arms or whatever to make you feel better. So I'm a designer. My primary role as a designer is to make sure that the people I'm designing for are satisfied by the overall user experience. The moment they're sad or annoyed by what I'm doing, I've done a really bad job and I should probably start to rethink my life a little bit. But this isn't just in product design, what I do. This is all around us. So everywhere you go, there's a chance that architects have really thought about how you would perceive time and redesign those spaces around you because of that. Airports is a good example. So who's been in an airport? Who has flown a long way, like 8 hours? Everyone. Well done. Good work. So last week, I came back from England. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm from England. I was visiting family. It took about 8 hours for me to fly to Ithaca. Not Ithaca. Nowhere flies to Ithaca. But I'd watch like 3 movies, I'd watch a bunch of episodes of Avatar, that kind of thing. And then by the end of it, the last thing I wanted to do was sit around a little while longer and wait for my bags to arrive. So airport designers don't want you to be frustrated when you're in the airport. So imagine it takes 15 minutes for your baggage to get from the airplane to the baggage carousel. The baggage handling process is already super efficient. They can only do that in 15 minutes, no matter what they do, no matter what they fix. So the only thing architects should think about is, okay, let's just increase the amount of time it takes you to reach the baggage carousel. Now, I've done a little sketch here. I started off with this wing and was like, okay, I've got this. This might look good. So, I'm going to use the laser pointer. Oh, wow. This bit here. So 15 minutes is how long it takes this imaginary load of bags to get from the plane to the baggage carousel. Ordinarily, in old school airports, the walk between the airplane and your baggage carousel would take 5 minutes. And what that means is you would stand at a baggage carousel for 10 minutes thinking, this is really boring, what am I doing? Airport designers thought, okay, let's just make a really, really complicated walk to the baggage carousel so that the person is only waiting 3 minutes for it and they think, hey, this airport's done a really, really good job. Even though they haven't, it's taken the exact same amount of time. So it's not a bad kind of manipulation, it's just a different kind. In this, you've managed to see those weird little hydrants where dogs can go pee, that kind of thing. You've been able to nip off the side to go to the toilet, that sort of thing. But you've waited as little time as possible. Back to digital world. So there's a magic number to think about when you're thinking about digital apps, and that is 3 seconds. So 3 seconds is the average amount of time it takes a user to abandon an experience. So that could be the amount of time it takes them to close down Instagram because something's taking too long to load, or a video on YouTube. And the reason being is that people are really, really easily distracted by whatever's happening. I'm sure you've all got very good jobs, that kind of thing, but no matter what you do, there's a chance that there's a competitor online, that kind of thing, who will be offering the same thing. And they're probably just going to bounce across to that experience instead of yours if it's taking more than 3 seconds to load. So we can think of speed as these 3 different things. So there's things that feel instant or immediate, and there's things that take so long that it makes the user want to abandon them. Instant actions are things that happen between 0 and 0.5 seconds. So these are things like flicking a switch for a light to come on, or using a TV remote, or in digital, hitting a form and waiting for it to say, this email address doesn't make sense, change something. Immediate actions are between 0.5 and 1 second. So this can be something like a page loading. So imagine you're going to The Guardian or the New York Times. This is a good amount of time to strive for when you're loading readable content on a page, and anything longer will start to feel like a drag. And this is where this point comes in. So this is the point of abandonment. So if the user receives no feedback in this time, there's a massive chance that they're going to start bouncing from your website. And only rarely should this happen. So if your experience is taking more than 5 seconds to load, more than 1 second to load, that's when we should start providing feedback to the user to say, hey, something's happening here, you just need to wait a little while longer before something happens. And these are three really, really good measures of speed to use when you're testing your site. A way to break this down is to think about the way people perceive time and the way people's brains work. So everyone in here, you're either going to be sitting in the active mode, which means I'm talking about something really interesting, or you're going to be in the passive mode, which means you're going to be bored and forgetting stuff. So during the active mode, something's happening and people don't realize that they're waiting at all. So like the airport example where you're making them walk for 12 minutes, they're in the active mode, they're walking around, looking at stuff, that kind of thing. And in the passive mode, nothing's really happening and people are getting bored, so they're more likely to drop out. So as a designer and as engineers, it's our job to keep people in that active mode and prevent them from being in the passive mode. A really good example of keeping people in the active mode is Instagram. Does everyone use Instagram here? Yeah. Few thumbs up. So you might know this, you might not, but when you're using Instagram, the moment you take a photo and pick your filter and start adding your description, location, tags, that kind of thing, Instagram's starting to upload that photo in the background. So here, this is already uploading. What that means is the moment I've finished adding all of this information, the first thing I see here is finishing up. What that feels like is that Instagram's done this instantly, and it hasn't. It's been uploading for a couple of minutes. It could have just taken that entire time. The application's keeping you busy while it's doing the slow and boring work in the background. A bad experience would start uploading the moment you hit share. And a nice little bonus about Instagram that I don't have here as an image, I used to have it in an old slide, is if this hadn't loaded yet, this nice Oliver, my mate, looking all muscular and whatnot, that would be blurred if it wasn't loading quickly enough. And that is another fairly okay way of keeping people away from that active mode. So it'll say, hey, something's coming. If you hang around a little while longer, you're going to see something really nice from Oliver. Another example, slightly different, is YouTube. So unlike apps, that kind of thing, a video doesn't need to download entirely before you can see it. So YouTube does a really, really good job of detecting bitrate, that kind of thing, and making sure that you can start watching even if this much of the video started and it doesn't buffer. What that means is the first thing YouTube does is gives you the content that you want to see before anything else loads. So it knows you don't really care about comments, stuff in the sidebar, that kind of thing. And it only buffers when absolutely necessary because it can drop down to like 240p or whatever it needs to do. So the reason these two things do such a good job is because they've done a lot of research into figuring out how to prioritize that content. Instagram knows that the most important task for you to be doing when you're using their app is uploading that photo. So it makes sure that that experience is the absolute key. YouTube knows that the only thing that you want to do when you hit that page is watch that YouTube video. You don't care about anything else. So that's what it does for you. They know that if they didn't do those things, that experience would be bad. And that's why things like Vimeo, I love Vimeo, but it doesn't particularly do a good job of this at the moment. They know that if this experience was bad, you wouldn't want to use that service. So I know I didn't say, I know I said that I didn't want to be prescriptive about this, but there are a few really, really simple ways to get started with this kind of thing. First up is blank and loading states. So chances are you've worked with somebody like me as engineers out there, and I've delivered you something that hasn't included blank states or loading states. Now, as a designer, it should be my responsibility to provide you with those things. I should be thinking, hey, this page is likely to sit in this ethereal space where nothing's happening. I should provide that to you. If your designer isn't providing that to you, you should reach out to them and say, hey, we need this, and kind of cater that relationship. If you're a developer, preloading content where possible is super helpful. John gave a really good talk last month about web fonts, that kind of thing. If we remember the abandonment point, what you need to be doing is making sure that content loads no less than 1 second before the user has hit that page. So even if the web font can't load, make sure that some kind of content displays on a page so that the user can read it. Most importantly is to do with the priority of content on the page. So I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the hierarchy of a page in terms of like semantics, that kind of thing, so like H1s. But what you need to be thinking about is the hierarchy of content from a user's perspective. So if I am going to Amazon.com, the most important thing for me on that website is probably the images of stuff. So before I want to see anything else on the page, I want to be seeing this really big, nice image. And if you don't know what that is, or are doing some guesswork, I don't know if anyone's ever gone around coffee shops around here, but I'm the guy that taps on people's shoulders and says like, hey, look at this, interrupting people. You can just get like 5 people to look at something pretty quick and say, what do you think should load on here first? Or you can just tweet it out, that sort of thing. It's just a really quick way of getting feedback to figure out what you think should load first. Most importantly, and I think I said most importantly on the previous slide, so even more importantly than the most important thing is this little guy. It's not him, I just like that photo. I couldn't think of a slide to put in here. So, I am an Englishman, and one thing English people aren't good at is complimenting themselves. I think, and I'm sorry for complimenting myself here, I think I'm quite good at working with front-end developers and engineers. And we've got a nice, we've got a lot of mutual respect. So I think one way to enhance these kinds of things is to cater really, really good relationships with these other teams. So if you're an engineer, start chatting to designers about like, hey, you know, we could be doing this. And if you're a designer, do it the other way around. Because if you have that friendly, nice relationship, then you're going to really be able to fine-tune all of these improvements. And what that means as well is that you're hopefully going to both understand the requirements and priorities in all of these discussions. So if you've done the coffee shop thing I spoke about, you're both going to know, hey, this content needs to load first. How can we make this enticing and keep the user happy throughout this? And it will make your working relationships better too. That's one thing I think I'm okay at. Okay. Yes, so there's one more magic number that I want you to know, and that's the number 20. So for a user to notice there's been any change in your site at all, it needs to be 20% faster. It's pretty slow, but if your site at the moment today takes 5 seconds to load, it needs to take at least 4 seconds to load for anybody to notice that difference whatsoever. It still falls within that abandonment point, so you're going to want to sort that out. But still, that was just an easy number for me to figure out when I was jet lagged last week. So yeah, so that's still too slow, but always aim for at least 20%. And the measuring of this is obviously a little bit more complicated because we all live in Ithaca, we've all got pretty bad internet connections, I imagine. So the way that I tend to do this is I've been fortunate enough to work in companies that have a large number of users who are more than willing to provide feedback to us. What I tend to do is just get a group of those users, even if it's like 700 people, and send them a little website and say, hey, have a look at this, and then shoot them to a survey that says, how long do you think this takes to load? What's good about this is that it works back to that brain time thing, so you can work out the average perception. And the reason you need a large number of people to do this is because of the whole internet speed thing before. This is my last point in the presentation, and it kind of goes against everything I've just told you, because there are some scenarios where you don't want the experience to be fast, and that's to do with trust. Has anyone here ever heard of the labor illusion? Except my wife. Because I've told her about it before. You've heard about it.
Yes.
So the labor illusion means that some things feel as though they should take longer for very specific reasons. So there's a very boring story that I'm going to tell you right now about a financial calculator. So this was a system that was built so well by designers and engineers that it worked almost instantly. You could go to this experience and it would tell you whether or not you were able to get a mortgage or a loan, that kind of thing, but it happened almost instantaneously. You all know that those kind of calculations aren't particularly difficult, but the man on the street wouldn't particularly know that. They would expect, with their finances, that kind of thing, you'd be spending a little bit more time to think about it. So as a designer, if we created an experience that was really, really quick, my gut feeling was that it would test very well. The exact opposite was true. People were phoning up, complaining about it, that kind of thing. And what the developers did to fix that is they added a fake interstitial screen which said calculating. It added like a 10-second step to this thing that didn't actually exist. Nothing was happening, it was just there. After that, people were satisfied about it, even though it was slower. So that's something to consider. My brother also uses this for emails at work. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, but you know, he uses that principle there too. So to summarize this, the main thing to think about is that people think stuff takes longer than it actually does. And when you're thinking about page speed on a site, running stuff through Google's page speed, it's very biased towards that clock time. It doesn't take into consideration that brain time thing. So it shouldn't just be about caching, that kind of stuff. It should be about the perception of speed too. So thank you for listening to my short talk. This is the first talk I've given in like 4 years. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'm Luke Jones. Or if you go to this little bit.ly, that's a post which is about this talk on Marvel. It's got a whole bunch of further reading and that kind of stuff on there. Are there any questions? Keeping in mind that I'm not an engineer and I'm being faced with a whole bunch of technical folks.
In those time windows you're talking about a while back,
Yep.
0 to 0.5 goes instantaneous, beyond that is fast. When you're putting a design together, if you have the time for it, do you actually spec each of those states? So you're like, here's what my app looks like in between 0 and 0.5. If it goes on longer than that, it should look like this.
No, so I'll repeat that for people watching the stream. So the question was, and I'm a little bit drunk, so I'm terribly sorry. The question was, do I spec each of the increments between instant, immediate, and abandonment? And my question there is, my answer there is, I don't spec all of them. I only tend to spec the immediate and abandonment states. I will always, so today, for example, Sander can attest to this, I was doing a loading state for a button, which was to do the instantaneous state, but that's fairly rare, because when I think about instantaneous stuff, I'm thinking, when I hit submit, that email should validate and say, hey, no. But anything more than that, we should really try our best to provide any of those interstitial states. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I kind of have one that goes on that. I guess, like, so you're, from the design perspective, when you're working with a technical person, what would your advice for a to communicate to a designer like when blank states are needed, you know? Because obviously the designer, it's not their, I guess, responsibility to like spec out each individual time frame for everything, because that would take forever. But how does, like, what's the best way for like, for someone working with you to sort of like let you know which things will need loading or which don't? Because a lot of times it's not intuitive, I guess, unless you're like actually deep in like the technical side of it.
So is that question about, is that asking me?
From the designer's perspective,
How long?
What's the best way for developers to like communicate that, or even like a less technical designer, like what's sort of the easiest way to communicate?
So what's
like,
the best way to communicate from an engineering perspective to me?
Right.
How long those requirements for additional states?
Yeah, I guess mostly because it's unintuitive when loading might happen if you're on the design side.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think honestly, just talk to people. Like, I know that's pretty obvious, but one.
No, I'm never gonna do that.
So one thing I've noticed is, have you ever been in the situation where you've been worrying about what a client would think, and in the end you just phone them and talk to them and it's fine? It's exactly the same with designers. A designer fully intends to provide those kinds of things to you. The only reason they don't is because they don't know those requirements exist. So if you're upfront about those kinds of requirements, they'll know from then on that they're needed. They'll happily work with you for it, and then in the future, they'll be thinking about those kinds of things. And then if they're a little bit funny with you about providing those, then that's a personal problem. I think they need to check themselves. Bad designers. Any other questions? Hey.
If you're working with a product and you can tell the stakeholders or the investors that people will abandon it after 5 seconds, it's a very compelling argument.
Yes.
If you're not working with a product, if you're working for like an internal business tool, maybe the stakeholders, the investors, your people are required to use that tool. So
Yes.
if it takes 3 minutes to run a report,
Yep.
they still have to sit there and wait 3 minutes. They don't get to abandon that tool, but they're probably getting very frustrated. So what's the best way to measure that frustration or make the case to the investors that some time needs to be spent
Okay.
on that experience?
So I'm going to repeat it again for this cheeky chap. So that was for internal tools, such as like an intranet or something. They've obviously got a different audience to external tools, including the stakeholders. So there's less money incentive, I suppose, to reducing the amount of time it takes people to wait. So how do we measure that frustration and improve that internally? That's a really tough one. I would just do some internal research. If, again, I feel as though people are inherently good and wanting positive things. So if you do a bunch of research that says everyone's unhappy, if we make these changes, people will probably be happier. So at a previous place I worked called Huddle, often we would have scenarios in which stuff would cost a lot of money or take a lot of time to do. What they were really good at, and I think what most people are good at, is if you presented research and solutions to them, they'd relent and say, hey, look, maybe it is worth us spending time on doing this. But that's a very tough situation because internal tools are horrible. So, I'm sorry.
Do you work at Cornell? Yeah, intranet! Why do we have an intranet? What does that mean? I hate it. It's internet.
I raised my hand.
Sorry.
So if you think about the whole arc of developing a website, sorry, I have funny questions. I'm sorry.
He loves it.
I mean, like, outside the internet question, I mean, there's this relationship between a necessity to use a tool versus the diversity of options out there, right?
Okay.
Doing things through the web and internet, you might have to use it in the internet when you're like looking for news or something. It's a different thing. Like, if you think about the arc of developing a design and an
Yeah.
right? But what is the actual additional load it takes?
So do you mean what is the additional load time it takes to implement these kinds of things?
Engineer, like, the perception of speed in your,
So it's surprisingly not that much extra time. I'd say it's worse if you tack it onto the end of things because you have to go back and build this into it, which is always a bit of a hassle, especially if your platform's grown more. But if you think about it up front, then you're already building in those interstitial steps and making sure those loading states exist. So it's days. It's not weeks. Those little improvements might take longer, but really, it's only people like YouTube or Instagram that are going to really, really want to refine those over and over and over again to make sure they're much quicker. I would suggest recommending these kinds of improvements from the off or quickly afterwards. So it's not a huge amount of time. Anyone else? No? Lovely. Well, thank you very much.
All right, everyone, give a warm welcome to Ben. He's going to talk about microservice architecture.
Yes, so microservices architecture. Don't do this. Basically, the point of, where do I, uh-oh.
Try it now. Any questions? No. Try it. Wait.
There,
Try it now.
there we go. Aha. Oh, I've changed my slides so many times I forgot what's next. All right. Yeah, don't do this. So the gist of this talk is reasons why not to do microservices architecture, at least up front. I'll actually talk a little bit about it, obviously, towards the end. But I think you'll see the gist as we go along. So first of all, I was almost done with the slide deck, and then I realized I'd never actually defined microservices. And while I've been in this for too long, and it kind of is obvious to me, I figured it was worth at least trying to define a little bit. This is maybe one of the better definitions I came across from Martin Fowler. But just generally, the idea is that you're kind of building your system out of lots of little small pieces that are each deployed individually, and they all kind of talk to each other often over HTTP, but maybe over something else. And for me, more services, more problems. Like, this is almost never the way you want to go unless you're kind of in a very specific niche, and we'll get into that. So don't do this. Don't do this. Seriously, don't do this. Consider a majestic monolith. So this is a great blog post. I'll post these slides, and you can click through from the makers of 37 Signals guys. Basecamp, yeah. Anyhow, they're big on this majestic monolith. They're the makers behind Rails. They kind of have done all the Rails stuff. You can do incredible things for a moderate to large-ish website, or probably even better, with just a monolith. And by monolith I mean just your regular. You have a Rails app. You have a whatever PHP app. You've got your Python stack, whatever it might be. That is, everything's in one service. Everything's in one repository. You build your service. You put it on Heroku or wherever you want it to go, and it just works well. And the majestic part here is that if you're good about kind of being rigorous with how you design it, how you kind of structure your code, this is going to work really well for you, and you're going to be able to scale it quite well, both from a performance perspective, also from people working on it. You know, you can have a couple of different teams working on this thing. Maybe you pull apart one or two little specialized things on the side, but really the whole gist of what you're trying to build is in one code base in one service. So if that still doesn't work for you, take on microservices begrudgingly. I kind of made up these rule of thumb, but I think it seems about accurate. Unless you've got something like on the order of more than maybe 5 teams or 25 developers working on your system, don't think about kind of breaking this up. Think about structuring your code better such that you can work in different parts more easily, but don't kind of go whole hog with pulling out all these services. So for me, the thing about microservices is it's not about technology. And I've kind of alluded to this a couple times here with the idea of, wait until you've got a certain number of developers, a certain number of teams, that, you can get really far with this monolith. It's about the business. And that's why I said, really don't do this, because most of the time, most systems, most services, most companies are not growing to the point where any of this makes any damn sense. It's really about scaling the product organization. And I'm sure maybe there's other cases where you're not just in a product development kind of organization inside a startup or a technology company. But that's typically where we see these microservices kind of grow and flourish. It's really about continuing to have fast product delivery when you've got tens to hundreds to maybe thousands of developers. And that's when you have to start thinking about how you can horizontally scale your teams, how you can kind of start looking at your business and your product organization like its own system, like its own service that you want to think, how do I horizontally scale this? How do I decouple these things? Let's take our engineering rigor and kind of apply it back to our product organization so that we can continue to scale this and move quickly. So I like to kind of think about it as architecting the product organization. The point here is trying to figure out how do we move towards microservices, and really the questions we should be asking are not about the technology choices or the microservices architecture buzzwords. It's thinking about the business and about the team. So when we want to start taking a service and breaking it into these smaller microservices, as they're called, we want to think about our business domains first, not about our kind of technology choices. One term that's thrown around a lot is called bounded contexts. That comes from a way of kind of design called domain-driven design. I'll throw these out there as kind of places that you can jump off to if you're interested in this stuff. But the point is to really kind of find these logical boundaries in your business that you can then start kind of digging into to find the services that you want to break your overall system into. But again, it's being driven from the business. It's being driven from how your company is thinking about its business and how you're structuring the different pieces of your business. You want to look for places where you're going to get this kind of high cohesion and low coupling. So, and I'll kind of make this a little more concrete in a minute. I'll kind of walk through how Invision thinks about these things. But yeah, the point is, this is kind of general good development practices, even in the small, right? We want to think about our groups of functionality, and we want to think about how do we kind of group functionality that sits together closely in one chunk and kind of decouple that from another group of functionality that kind of has its own influence on the side. So we want to take these bounded contexts that we kind of discover in our system, really. And there's a lot of practices that you can go in and look in when you look into bounded contexts of like how to pull apart your system, how to pull apart your business in these different contexts. And you want to take those once you've discovered them and then put your services inside these contexts. The point here is that you kind of create your rigid APIs around these contexts, and then the communication between these different contexts, that's kind of the important part from an architectural perspective, because that's the stuff that's a lot harder to change over time. That's the part where you're going to have teams that are going to have to agree on what that API looks like, and they're going to want to develop against that. So you want to have that's the seams between all these different teams. And that's the important part to keep a focus on when you're thinking about the overall architecture of what you're trying to build. The other way to think about microservices, or kind of another piece to bring into this, is how you're going to structure your team. So there's this law, Conways Law, and basically it came up from this guy Conway kind of observing that when you're building a system, the system tends to reflect how the teams that built it are organized. So if you've got 5 teams, you're going to end up building something that kind of has 5 components, because inside that team, the communication is going to be better. They're going to try and build their thing together. They're going to have a higher bandwidth conversations. But across teams, there's going to be more formalization, more standardization, more APIs, because the communication is going to be lower there. So they're going to strive to have more formal kind of communication. And this was kind of just an observation of like, oh, hey, isn't that interesting? But what people have taken this is now, let's take that and like run with it. Let's make that, use that to our advantage. Let's organize our teams in the way that we want to see our system develop and organized. So instead of just the trivial anecdote that is always kind of thrown around in Conways Law is if you have 5 teams developing a compiler, you end up having a 5-pass compiler, because that's just how you end up organizing these things. If you want to have your, if you've gone through, found your bounded context, found how you want to decompose this system, then you align those with teams, and then you'll kind of just, you're reinforcing the way that you're going to structure this architecture by the fact that you've got these teams working individually on these different pieces, and then between those bounded contexts, you'll have the stronger APIs because, again, reinforced by these teams because they're going to want to have those stronger APIs because they're going to have less communication between the teams versus inside of the teams. Right, so teams own these kind of bounded contexts. So that was a lot of talking and a lot of like hand waving. Basically, you want to have it kind of look like this. Like you've got these bounded contexts, they've got services inside of them, team owns them. There's a lot of like kind of abstract words here, but this is kind of the way to think about these things. And like I said, a lot of this is so if people are interested, also don't do this, but if you're interested, like you can dig into these terms a little bit more. The last piece I'll point on, and this is interesting because it's actually something my team is currently going through, is figuring out how to align the incentives with the team and with the services and the context that they own. So there's a term, objectives and key results. This is very kind of, it feels very businessy speak. It was popularized by Google, but it's really a way of kind of aligning all of your teams. Again, right, the context we're in is like dozens of teams or more, trying to get everyone to kind of march in the same direction. And the important part here is that you want to make sure that not only do you have your teams kind of aligned with the services and the domains that they own, but also that you want to have them incentivized in the right places. So that, yeah, forgot my slides. So that they're incentivized to work on these services. So I'll kind of give the example in a minute about my specific team, but we have found ourselves in a situation where we're the primary developers on a service that we don't own technically, because we are incentivized to be doing a lot of the feature work on that, and the team that owns it isn't. And so we're actually in the process of moving that over to better align with our incentives. So we're kind of taking over that domain that we've carved out in the abstract and kind of realigning it with our teams so that these are all, as best we can, kind of in alignment. Yes, Invision, but actually, before I kind of really mention this, I think the broader point is that microservices is really just a tool to help organize the product organization so that you can continue to kind of move quickly. And that's really the end goal here. And you only, in my opinion, want to break down services enough that you can let these teams kind of flourish and move individually without kind of getting constantly tied up with dependencies on each other. All right, so Invision. Let's kind of give like a more like concrete example of this, because it's been a lot of like, abstract terms going through. And I get a shameless plug in here. So I'm going to go through some of the kind of the business domains we have at Invision, at least in my mind. So prototypes, this is kind of the core of what Invision does. You can build kind of these interactive prototypes of a design that you're working on, a new application, a new experience that you're trying to build. And this is one of the business domains that we have at Invision. And I'll explain kind of, as I go through. This is owned entirely by one team, right? And so they own this business domain, and then they own all of the services related to that domain. And I'll just keep working through that. So boards is another piece that we have at Invision. You can create kind of these idea boards, mood boards. You can bring in pictures and text and all sorts of different things to kind of get a sense of the product you're trying to build or the experience you're trying to develop. And this is another business domain that we have, and a different team owns this and all the services related to it. And as you'll see as we kind of keep going through it, it's kind of, yeah, you're finding these vertical slices through your service that a team can own kind of all the way top to bottom, right? So when I say service, I mean literally the front end single page app all the way through to the database is owned by this one team, and there's a bunch of services in between, and I'll kind of explain how those services tend to look. Freehand is another chunk of what Invision provides as a business, as an offering, right, as one of our services that we offer. This is, again, owned by one team all the way top to bottom. Studio is a new piece that we're rolling out right now. This is actually, I'm on the team that develops the web front end for this, and we own basically most of all of this, and that's kind of part of what I was mentioning too, that we're moving some of these services around, but this is another business domain and is owned by primarily one team. We also, so that was also like individual services, but we also have some of these cross-cutting domains, right? So we have comments. Comments is owned by one team. They build kind of this widget that you can pop into like a component, I think it's a React component that you can put on your single page app, and then it will talk to its own set of services and data storage and whatnot, so that we can have a kind of unified commenting system across the entire application. And then you can see like a unified notifications of all the comments you've seen on all the different types of different documents we've seen.
As you're running through these, are you thinking of these, or like, so this talk started out with microservices, are these
Yeah, so these are the business domains. These are the bounded context or the business domains that you then try and build a team around, or a team might own potentially a few of these, but the idea is my perspective is you start with your business domains, and then you try and figure out which teams those live on. The value there is that you could potentially move these business domains, as I'll kind of point out a little bit later. So they're a little bit abstract from just like, this is the comment team, right? Yeah, so once you've got your business domains, then you give that to the team, and then the team builds that into services from there. But you want to keep this kind of alignment of team owns a business domain, and then you put services inside that business domain. And the last one I think I'll point out is inspect, and this is your ability to kind of go into a design and look at the different components, pull out images, pull out different pieces of it, and this is inspect sitting inside of the studio display. And that is another example of one of these components that lives in a front-end experience, but would then talk to its own set of services. And this is an interesting case because this was initially owned by one team, then my team took it over, and now we might be in the process of handing it back to that initial team. So you kind of can ping pong these things. But if you're, again, kind of back to that question, if you're thinking about these as domains that you can kind of move around, they're a little easier. You'll design things in a way that are easy to facilitate that movement, which is important kind of over the course of development and the life of the company, because you'll grow, you'll split teams, you'll want to be able to move different domains in different places. You might have just more bandwidth on one team than another for the next 6 to 12 months, and so you're going to move something over here for now. So I've been kind of mentioning this as we've been going, but what does Invision's product organization look like? So as I said, a team owns one or more business domains. They then own all the services for those domains. There's probably an asterisk here, to the best of the ability. There are still cross-cutting concerns that are a little bit wonky, but it's something that we're continuing to work through. And that's kind of where this formal handoff to transfer domain ownership comes in. That's kind of what I was saying, is that if it makes more sense to say, hey, this domain should go with this team for now for incentive reasons or for staffing reasons, that's facilitated by kind of already having these things in these nice little packages of a business domain. And you can say like, hey, you're going to take this whole domain and you'll take the services related to it, and it'll stick with one team. The value there is that when you want to build a new feature for that domain, you're the team that owns all of that. You don't have to go talk to some other team or put a feature request on their backlog and like wait for 6 months or whatever for them to get around to it. You should be the one owning that.
Do you follow like a squad-based structure?
We use the word squads. Yes, yes, we do use the word squads. What do we call it? Well, we have just recently renamed teams to squads and what I used to call squads to zones, but we do have this idea of, guess who just hired an SVP of product development? We did. No, it's actually, I think it's all for the good, and that's actually part of what's driving this is that we're trying to align those groups of teams, we're calling them zones, I think you would call them squads, to be focused on certain incentives, and as such, we're realizing, and I really appreciate it because we're seeing what I've already been seeing. I'm like, we're doing all the work on this service over here. They don't seem to care about it, but they own it. This is really weird. We're like realizing, oh yeah, no, actually the incentives don't make any sense. Let's shovel it over here. Right, so my team, we own the sharing domain for prototypes, kind of our older initial offering for prototyping, and for studio sharing. And that means we own the single page app and the backend for front end for both domains. I will mention backend for front end, we'll get to that in a second. However, as I was just saying, to better align with incentives, we're taking ownership of the studio domain service, and I'll get back to this. I put these out of order from what I should have gotten to. Anywho, I'll get to what that means, and then we're now relinquishing ownership of the prototype sharing stuff to this other team that owns the prototype domain service. So as you like, there's a lot of moving parts, right? Because we're teams, we only have so much headcount, we're bringing in stuff, we need to get rid of some stuff, but we're finding these ways, because it's built kind of in this modular component stuff, we can kind of easily move these things around. And enough people have, we try and standardize on a few languages, a few toolkits, so that people can kind of jump in on this. And we have that formalized handoff. And that's not like a, hey guys, you own this, right? It's like a many-week type of, we're going to talk through the code, we're going to talk through the monitoring, we're going to talk through the operations, we're going to figure out all the pieces so that this other team feels comfortable saying, yeah, we own this now. And so I think this has worked really well. And it's all kind of predicated on that idea of we've got these domains, we've got the services inside of the domains, and it makes it easier to move these things around because you've got those formalized APIs around these domains. It's easier to kind of just pick up and move over here, and not everything isn't kind of intertwined, right, and tangled. That would make it much more difficult to say, oh, we're going to pull off this kind of piece over here. It's already easily split because it's based on services that are kind of wrapped in this business domain. All right, so it is a little bit about tech. And this is where I kind of went out of order, but I'm going to talk through, yeah, I've got time, to talk through some of these architectural patterns for microservices. And this is actually like, I changed all the names, but this is really like a picture from our docs at Invision. So this is quite literally like how we kind of develop this stuff. So API gateway is one of these patterns for microservices. The idea here is you've got a single point of entry for all your requests. That's this kind of big blue bar here. Everything that comes into the system comes through this service. Yes? That would be awesome. No.
I don't know what what does API mean? I use it, but I mean, I
Application Programmer Interface?
Is that what it means? Like sometimes with like Twitter, it's like, oh, Buffer won't let Twitter upload 5 megabytes because of their API.
Right.
But I didn't know it had,
It's like
it meant something.
it's like the software interface that you have to like talk with this other system. So in that case, like, I can't remember the order you had that in, but like Twitter says that you can't have more than 5 meg uploads, and so Instagram is talking to Twitter through their API. They try to make that request, and that request is denied because of that limit.
So wait, I'm sorry, what does it stand for again?
Application.
Application.
Yeah, programmer interface.
Programming interface. Got it. I'm gonna write that down.
Right, so the really nice part about API Gateway is that this can handle all of the boring crap that you don't want to think about from like network requests. That's like authorization, rate limiting, blacklisting of IPs, dealing with sessions and refreshing sessions and JOTs and tokens and God knows what. It also has like all sorts of metrics built in and all these other things so that you kind of build your services behind it and don't have to think about a lot of these issues that you'd otherwise have to think about. That, for me, at least from the programmer's perspective, is like the nice real benefit. The other benefit is that you just have more flexibility in how you're going to structure like your actual URLs and everything. Everything can be at like api.envisionapp.com or whatever it might be, slash, my service, slash your service, slash the other service. And that just ends up being, I think, a nicer way of dealing with it rather than having, typically the other way around would be myservice.envisionapp.com and yourservice.envisionapp.com. Specifically for Invision App, we do the kind of Slack model of like, it's teamname.envisionapp.com, and that obviously wouldn't work if we had to have different subdomains for different services. So that's all a long way around of saying API Gateway, very nice pattern. You can pull it off the shelf from Amazon or from, I'm sure all the other web provider or like cloud providers have something like that. That'll do this kind of like path-based routing. But we're using an open source product. That's fine too. Backend for front end. So this is a pattern that definitely gets talked about a lot, but I hadn't really heard of it until I kind of started diving into microservices. The idea with this is that, maybe I should have gone from the bottom up, but the idea with this is that you've got a client. It needs to talk to something on the back end behind that edge gateway that's going to do any client-specific type of work that needs to get done. So as we go forward, you'll see we've got all these different APIs around all the different business domains that we were talking about, and your front-end experience wants to show data from 5 of them. How do you do that? Well, you don't want your front end to go talk to all these different services. Like, not only is that kind of like latency heavy, it's kind of rather brittle. And you may also want to be doing some data transformation. Maybe you have to make a request to some API, but you need to enrich it with some other data from a different API, or you want to filter out some other data, but you've got to do that on your end for whatever reason. You can put that all kind of inside your network, and so that is much lower latency because you're talking service to service inside your network, and you've got a lot more compute power back there rather than on someone's Windows 95 laptop with IE6 on it. So you have a lot more control there, and the biggest important key for me is that the front end experience and that back end for front end always have to kind of live together on the same team. The point of the back end for front end is to give that front end team the ability to move really quickly, and maybe there isn't even like a back end API that exactly fits their purpose, but they can munge the data enough in their front end, in their back end for front end, that they can like make it work and get moving and unblock themselves. And again, so much of this comes back to how do we just get teams to move quickly? When we've got dozens of teams, 20 plus teams, I think we have at Invision right now, 100 plus developers, like how do we just get people to move fast without being blocked and bottlenecked by other teams? All right, domain services. This is the one that they own their database. They're the kind of the level down here. They own their own database, which I'll just, and they have their own database, and each database is just owned by one service. So you don't have this kind of cross services talking to different databases. That's very important, because if you end up with that, it's just a mess. And they're really primarily about the storage, possibly permissions and some other pieces that kind of go around with the business domain. They're kind of the crux of those domains that we were talking about. And then they provide these ideally fairly generic endpoints that then these backend for front ends can kind of consume and mix and match and combine and aggregate together in whatever way is necessary for the front ends to actually work. And one thing to point out, I actually have some components in here too. I didn't really mention them, but this is kind of the stuff we were talking about with the comments and inspect, that you can have these kind of components inside of an app, but they should really be talking to their own back end for front end and kind of having this connection. So again, that one team owns that whole slice and can move quickly. Yeah, and finally we have some core services, and that is the stuff at the bottom, and it's like stuff that you could basically have from Amazon, but we have our own wrapper around. Usually the wrappers around third-party services. We've got an emailer, we've got asset storage, which is like a wrapper around S3, and it's nice to kind of have just like that interface there. You can put a little extra logic that's your own, you know, in the case that you wanted to go do something crazy, you could like swap out something that you store against. I don't know. You wouldn't really do that, but you know, it's nice to have kind of a point of contact. You can also abstract away a lot of stuff. We had S3 is pretty awesome, but you know, managing uploads to it, especially in an efficient way from a front end, managing all sorts of like security pieces around it, that kind of stuff can get to be a hassle. And so we kind of put it all in one service, and people get that for free, and it is a pretty good improvement. So yeah, that's kind of a lot of very high level. I mean, I haven't dug too deep, but I wanted to kind of give a sense of like, this is kind of the framework that we think about when we're building new services or building new functionality at Invision. Is, you know, we've got a lot of teams that own single page apps and their back end for front end, like those always come together. And then often they'll own the back end domain service, or, you know, in my team's case, we're trying to kind of bring more alignment with those so that we have better ownership of the whole stack so that we can move more quickly. And remember, don't do this. So that's pretty much it. I see a lot of hands. Hopefully that was helpful. I mean, really, it's very little about tech, and it's all about teams and business and trying to make it all work. So I did see your hand, but now it's not up again.
Yeah, it's all about business, but mine's a tech question.
Yeah, no. By all means.
Yeah, so I don't work on teams of 25 people or more and never have, so take this with a grain of salt. Can we go back to the diagram?
Yeah.
I was wondering if all these connections represent client-server connections where it's all a request-response model, or would you see any queues in here?
It's a good question. So there is actually in the real picture an event bus right here, and I kind of just left it off because I wasn't sure how much time I'd have, though. I guess I could have put it on. Where it's also something relatively new to us. So there's two places for queues in our system. One, I would say, is inside a bounded context, and one is outside. Inside the bounded context, that's your team's decision. You get to do whatever you want with that, basically. If it's two services that talk to each other inside that context, they can do whatever they feel like to make that work. A lot of people are using SQS because it's there and it's available and it's easy to use. We do have Kafka on the side, and we're still pretty new on that, but that is our like asynchronous way of communicating between these different services. All these arrows would be synchronous HTTP calls. This would be, you know, outside our network, and all of this is inside our network, but it is, you know, just HTTP. It's JSON over HTTP for everything. The event bus stuff is something we're still kind of figuring out the best approach for, but a lot of it we're finding is valuable for kind of that asynchronous decoupled communication of like a thing happened. So one, for instance, is like the asset storage says like an upload happened, and it gives out the upload key and maybe some information about that upload, and then it doesn't know who cares about that. You know, that just goes to everybody. The other way we're using it, one of the use cases is for WebSocket communication here. So it's, you know, one of these services can say a new prototype showed up, and then, you know, maybe there's another service here that controls that first homepage that you see, which is like my current docs and like most recent favorites or whatever. And so a new prototype shows up, and maybe you're on that website, and now like, ooh, look, a new prototype showed up because my friend just shared it with me. And so again, that's one of those like, this service doesn't know that over here, this backend for front end gives a damn about that prototype. It just says like, this happened. And so that, we're finding that to be valuable, because otherwise you either need to have this like polling set up between these two, or you need this to know like, everyone who cares about this has to come register with me, and that's like just a disaster. So yes, absolutely, there's asynchronous stuff. You've got another finger at you, Steve.
So, how do you line hardware up with your microservices? And then, so you're responsible, so I'm thinking of like load.
Yeah.
You screw your own software, you take someone else's stuff down, and therefore cascading?
Kubernetes? Yeah, no, everything is in a Docker container in Kubernetes, and it magically scales with pixie dust. I guess I'm being a little bit flip because we have a platform team. Again, another one of the reasons, like, don't do this. We have, I don't know, 20, 30 people. All they do is, like, make our platform awesome. And so they are the ones that are going to sit there and make sure that we've got enough EC2 boxes to run all of the Docker containers that we need. And if someone wants to auto-scale and we don't have any more EC2 containers, I hope they have that auto-scaled, or I hope they get an alert for it. Yeah. Something like that, yep.
It seems to me that microservices could be a solution to the problem we find in teams where different people have different core competencies and different technologies or different architectures. And I can see a potential for these different microservices vastly differing in their implementation styles. How much at your organization do you guys enforce standards, both from a visual perspective, also from an architecture and third-party technology perspective?
All right, architecture, visual, technology. Visual, we're starting to get a lot better about this. We're getting a design system put in place. We have like a whole design org, and we have a design ops team in that org that is like taking the design system and turning it into actual pieces that we can use. So that's a work in progress. Architecturally, I would say we're pretty good at, like, you do this. This is what you do. And people are pretty good about it. I would say inside any one of these boxes, it's a bit of a free-for-all. We're pretty clear that, like, Go is the right language, but we have enough people that know a lot of Node, and Node used to be the right language for us, that it's still used a lot. So even that isn't, like, set in stone. And then certainly within that, like, man, we have one team that loves them some CQRS, and the whole thing is like event store based, and it's like a wacky craziness, but that's what they did. And I think we're going to start seeing some pushback to some of that. I think for a long time we really liked this idea of, like, each team is its own startup and it gets to do its thing. And that's true up until you have other teams trying to, like, contribute to what you've developed or needing to take over what you've developed. And then everyone looks at it and goes, what the hell is that? So yeah, I think it's a little bit tricky. I think we're good at the bigger pieces, and we wanted to give teams a lot of leeway, but we're going to have to continue to work with that mix.
If I have a user account with, say, Invision Studio,
Mm-hmm.
I also have an account with Invision for prototyping.
Yes.
So is one of your microservices just basically an identity service?
Sorry, what service?
An identity service?
Yes. Yep. We have a user service and an accounts service and a team service, and they all kind of are very closely related. And yeah.
Cut across every business domain.
Right.
The team owns those services.
So there is a team that owns, like, users and teams, as, like, that's what they work on, and, like, auth, sign in, like, I keep on, like, stammering because it's kind of split between two teams. As you can see, there's a lot there. No, it's a great question because it's, like, really gets to the meat of it. The team, there's one team that owns, like, the user experience around that. So, like, the UI you log into, and then they own all the kind of services behind that. And then at some point it kind of moves into the platform realm because it's talking about, like, authentication and identity, well, authentication and, like, the edge gateway, right, is, like, the one that's when you're making API requests or, like, AJAX requests is the one validating all that stuff. So that is a platform team. And so these two teams are very closely, like, linked, and there's a lot of, like, back and forth. So that's a tricky one. I mean, there are domains where it's like, man, this is hard to untangle. They actually have, like, a users and a teams service, and they're realizing that like that delineation was kind of terrible, and they're actually moving to like combining the two again. So like, and this is again like it's in that context, so they get to kind of make those decisions as the team. But yeah, it's not always easy to find where to like slice and dice this stuff, and you make decisions and you can change them and you can kind of keep evolving the thing.
So think about, there's a lot of like big scale abstraction to how you might try and manage this sort of rollout. One of the words that I thought was interesting was incentivize.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to incentivizing teams, you being a part of the team, maybe managing people too, I don't know. What is the incentive? What does incentivization mean in this model within these teams that are both interlinked but also very focused on what they're supposed to deliver, maybe relative to other teams, maybe not?
Yeah, so this is something we're getting better at, but it does come back to this like OKRs idea, and again, something else you can look up on your after this talk. But the idea is that basically we have Invision at the top has like our 5 goals for this year or whatever, right? And then as we break that down, there are these zone squads that that are each individually responsible for like a slice of those things, right? So my team is part of the zone for collaboration. So we're like sharing things out and like commenting on things and like sharing designs with your coworkers. That all that kind of sharing collaboration stuff is under our umbrella group, and then that has objectives that we're trying to hit, or like objectives we're trying to hit for the year. And that mostly flows down through like our product managers, a little bit through the engineering managers as well. But like, basically they're going to prioritize, the product managers are going to prioritize features that they think are going to impact those objectives, to share, get 10% more users sharing documents or something, whatever that like objective is for this year. And then that scales down to the team, and our team is involved in like this part of sharing and collaboration on this particular document type. And then that's going to that's going to be our roadmap for the next 6 months, and then that's going to sit down to like what services and what domains should we own so that we can move quickly on those objectives and those aims that we're trying to do. So there's a lot, and it seems like holy bureaucracy crap. Honestly, it's not that heavy. It's like it's really mostly a lot of the overhead is in the conversations to everyone get like on the same page as to what the hell we're trying to do. But after that, it's like we're in collaboration. We want literally one of our goals could be like we want 10% increased sharing, and we're going to do that. And we're going to make sure we've lined ourselves up so we can execute on that. We can iterate on that. We can try new things. We can experiment and get that stuff out the door.
And is there like something that the end programmer experiences as a part of making that goal, or is it just like the good feeling of having contributed to Invision's?
In other words,
Yeah.
you get bonuses based on hitting your objective.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out, like, incentivization is an abstract idea. That's what I'm getting
Right.
at. Like, you can be all in on your company, but how does that feel to an end user,
More
end programmer?
more Kool-Aid? More Kool-Aid? Yeah. Your stocks go up.
Okay, but that's something.
I mean, that's like a thing, I guess.
I just wondered what his incentive.
No, it's not like a monetary thing. It is more that like, product owners it comes through the product owner flow, right? So it's more like, hey, your goal for the next 6 months is to move this indicator. Go do it. And at some point you're probably ranked against that, I guess. I don't really know.
I used to love that chaos. And if we didn't hit, then we got fired. That was your incentive.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, that's the stick, I suppose, approach. Yeah.
Two questions. The first one is, do you guys spend a lot of time writing documentation, and would it be kind of probably mostly at the layer where you've got an API wrapped around the database at the bottom of your diagram?
Yes, so documentation, we do quite a bit,
Standards for that?
partially because of this, partially because we're distributed, that it would just like is our way of life. Yes, all these are formal APIs that are, I don't know if we like absolutely require, but basically our de facto standard is Swagger. They are all like committed in the repo. They are supposed to be more formally published into like a Jekyll site that runs off of a GitHub repo. People are like, we've been moving so quickly, people are so about keeping that up to date, but you can always find like the latest version in the repo itself, which is typically what I just end up doing. You're right, there tends to be less documentation here because the idea is that this is fully owned by one team, and so internally they can kind of do whatever they need. We're finding that has broken down a bit with these components because these components sit in these different front-end apps. They often need a small amount of customization per each like app that they're in or each like document type they're working with. That work sometimes ends up being in here, so you've got a bunch of different teams like, hey, I want to introduce your component into my thing, and then I have to go into your back end and start mucking around with stuff and like, what the hell? So like literally last week, a coworker of mine was writing documentation for another team because they're like, I did all my work and I had no guidance, so here I'm gonna write your docs for you. And like, I'm doing that for that same team for a different part this week. So, but it's very collaborative in that way. It's like, when you find a problem, go fix it. So we're trying to document these things as we go. So yeah, we're pretty decent about documentation on that.
And then the second question is about change management. When you have to change your API, are you using semantic versioning or something like that? Or?
Yeah, we're doing like the boring version of like we've got V1 and V2 in the API route. We are still like just trying to get V1 out the damn door, so we haven't quite managed to hang ourselves yet with versioning. Certainly we're doing like, I think we're pretty good at semantic versioning for like these components at like a NPM level module thing. But so far we don't have great practices necessarily around this stuff. I think we can figure it out. We just haven't had to. In the times when we've had a couple really big breaking API changes, there's been the sense of like, we need to move quickly and there's no production users, so let's just break it and everyone will be chaos for 2 days and then we'll get back to going. And so we've kind of done that. So we haven't like had the opportunity yet to kind of learn well about that, but we do have that as like again, personally, I've like told people, hey, can we get some documentation around how to do this well so that we don't shoot our foot off later on?
How do you handle writing a test suite for some system?
You have really good questions. Testing sucks. Let's see. For it again, it kind of depends based on each team a little bit. A lot of teams, so certainly like unit tests are fine and whatever. We do a lot of how do we want to go? We do a good amount of mocking for either kind of these other services. Nothing's like formalized. It's just like we'll just spin up like an in-process kind of mock HTTP server and say like, when I send this, return that. I have pushed people a little bit to like try and use some tools out there that are actually built for this, but Go actually has pretty solid like built-in HTTP mocking, so people have just been using that. We do have some teams that are like super cool, like super excited about like the kind of service level integration tests. They've got, and we run everything in Docker and we run through CodeShip for our CI. So they've got a fairly in-depth setup where like it'll spin up a full like database for them and in a container in CI and then like run other tests that way. I've actually done that in the past with, there's some pretty good fake versions of like AWS services, S3, SQS, DynamoDB. You can spin those up locally and like test against them. So we do a decent amount of that, but our testing is definitely something we're still kind of learning on. We don't have really good like full end-to-end like multiple service integration level tests. Like we have testing environments. You can always go like poke around once you've deployed, but that's something we don't quite have hammered out yet. We have been pushing. Yeah. We do have we have some front end tests from some Cypress tests that like mock out a lot of the the back-end stuff that work that way. I'm trying to think, there was one other thing I was going to say. I don't know. There's a, oh yeah, we've been trying to like formalize actually testing the Swagger doc actually fits the API responses. So that's like, there's tools out there that'll kind of do that. We haven't spun that up yet, but that's like a thought. One thing in general people are really excited about, like in the industry in general, is these contract tests where you have kind of a specification, and from that specification you can generate a mock that like the calling service can call against and get responses, and then it'll also test that the backend service responds similarly. So it's almost this like asynchronous integration test where you like run some requests and expect some results from the consumer, and then you, in the CI of the producer, like run the same tests and see that the same results come back. So there's some crazy stuff out there that we still haven't, like we haven't dealt with any of that, but you know, this is pretty much, it's like still very much an active field of inquiry in like in microservice systems, like how you do that well. So.
Kind of related to the testing where you have many dependencies between services and stuff, but at the database level, if you have, say, a comment and that's made on a specific prototype, say that's something that happened, how do you keep track, like how do you handle that, especially in terms of database constraints, if you've got a separate database per service?
I feel like I understand the general gist, like the area of concern, because it is one, but I'm like not quite sure what the question was.
Like, if you've got your comments and your prototypes in different databases,
Right.
your comment can be tied to a certain ID of prototype or something. But it seems harder to enforce that you have good data if it's separate. Does that?
So like you could end up with like comments on a prototype that doesn't exist anymore, or like cascading deletes is a good like example maybe there. Yes, that is more difficult. That's another good use case for the event bus that I was kind of saying lives over here. That the idea being that when you delete a prototype, you should send off a message saying, hey, this prototype deleted, and whoever has references to that should then say like, oh, cool, I got to go delete my stuff. So for at least the cascading delete, like that's how we're approaching it. I mean, you also, at least the delete case is not terrible, because like no one's ever going to look up those comments because that prototype is gone. But I'm sure there are other cases where you can run into these issues, and yeah, it's tricky. I mean, the event bus is kind of a key piece of how this all fits together. And it's particularly tricky because there are like ways to make sure it works all the time, end to end, like is rock solid. But there's a lot of skill and knowledge that goes into making sure that that actually works. And so our approach so far has kind of been like, hey, can we make it so that our system works most of the time anyhow, even if it doesn't really work? Which is cool, because then it means like we don't have to be as rigorous with everything. But I think we'll also get into places where it's like a little bit of weird data pokes up, and then we'll have to kind of decide to what extent do we get more rigorous about how we integrate with this event bus, or just accept some weird data, or like maybe it's enough that we can just go in and like manually delete that when we find it, So there's definitely a lot to be figured out there still.
Stupid question. How many teams in design, and how average size of team?
Yeah, I think we were like, I counted today and now I've forgotten the number. I think it was around 20. Team size would be like, just engineers would be like 5-ish, 3 to 5, maybe up to 7 for the larger teams. That's going to come with a designer, an engineering manager, and a product manager, and an agile coach. Not all of those are like just for one team. There's, the manager will be for that team. The others might be for a team or 2 or 3. The whole org, I think, is like 100 folks, but I don't actually know if that might only include managers and engineers, not product and design, I think. Yeah, I think that's about right. And we're hiring. Any other questions? Great. Thank you.